The air in Belfast used to taste of coal smoke and fear. It was a city holding its breath. One moment, the mundane rattle of a milk float making its morning rounds. The next, the gut-wrenching blast that would shatter glass for streets around. The sound would hit you first. A deafening crack that felt like the sky was being torn apart. Then came the silence, a heavy, ringing void that was almost worse than the noise itself. People would freeze, their faces a mask of instant calculation. Where did it come from? How close was it? Is my family safe? The questions would fire through your mind before you even had a chance to think. After the silence, the sirens would begin. A mournful, rising wail that became the city's grim soundtrack. They were a constant reminder of the fragility of life here. You would see the aftermath painted across the familiar red brick terraces. A pub with its windows blown out, its cheerful sign now hanging crookedly. A butcher shop, its front obliterated, the ordinary scene of daily life violently interrupted. Debris would litter the pavement like cruel confetti. And always, the smell. The acrid scent of explosives and burning, a smell that clung to your clothes and your memory long after the fires were out. This was the backdrop to an entire generation's childhood. Children learned to distinguish the sound of a Saracen armored car from a delivery lorry. They knew which alleyways to avoid, which pubs were targets, which curbstones were painted in the colors of allegiance and danger. The peace walls sliced through communities, tall corrugated iron and brick barriers designed to keep neighbors apart. They were stark, physical manifestations of the division that was tearing the city's soul apart. These walls were more than just physical structures, they were psychological fortresses, reinforcing a sense of us and them that was etched into the very consciousness of the people living in their shadow. The threat was not confined to specific moments of violence, it was a low, persistent hum of anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily life. A trip to the shops involved a mental risk assessment. A car backfiring would make everyone on the street flinch in unison. People developed a sixth sense for trouble, a hypervigilance that became second nature. This constant state of alert, this readiness for the worst, was exhausting. It was a war fought not on a distant battlefield, but in your own neighborhood, on your own doorstep. The front line was everywhere, and the enemy could be anyone. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more content like this. The headlines and news reports from Belfast often focused on the grim tally of the dead and the wounded. They documented the bombings, the shootings, and the riots with stark clarity. The physical destruction was plain to see. The rubble of buildings, the twisted metal of cars, and the tragic images of coffins being carried through the streets. These were the visible wounds of the conflict, the tangible evidence of its brutality. They told a story of loss and devastation that the world could easily understand. But these visible scars, as horrific as they were, only told half of the story. They were the surface of a much deeper, more complex trauma. Beneath the surface of the physical violence lay a vast, unseen landscape of psychological pain. For every person injured by a bullet or a bomb, countless others were wounded in ways that left no physical mark. Their injuries were to the mind and to the spirit. They carried the weight of what they had seen, what they had done, and what they had lost. This was a war that burrowed deep into the psyche of the population, leaving behind a legacy of fear, stress, and broken trust that would linger for decades. The war wounds were not always visible, but they were profoundly real and deeply debilitating for thousands. This essay will journey beyond the bullet and the bomb. We will explore the hidden cost of the Troubles. Through the powerful first-hand stories of those who lived through it and the insights of experts who have studied its aftermath, we will shine a light on this psychological toll. We will hear from former combatants, civilians, and the children who grew up in the shadow of the conflict. Their experiences reveal the profound and lasting impact of living in a state of constant threat. They speak of a pain that is often silent, a struggle that is frequently fought alone, long after the news cameras have gone. Understanding this hidden dimension of conflict is crucial. It is not unique to Belfast. In every war zone, in every community torn apart by violence, there are these unseen injuries. They affect individuals, they strain families, and they can poison the very foundations of a society, making true peace a fragile and difficult prize. By looking closely at the psychological shadow of the Troubles, we can begin to grasp the full human cost of war and recognize the long, arduous path to healing that must follow. It is a story about the resilience of the human spirit, but also a cautionary tale about the deep wounds that violence leaves behind. The conflict in Belfast was a particular kind of hell. It was not a traditional war with clear front lines and uniformed armies. It was a close-quarters urban guerrilla war. This created a unique and pervasive form of psychological stress. The enemy was not a distant, abstract figure. They could be your neighbor, the person you passed in the street, or someone who frequented the same local shop. This blurring of lines between friend and foe, between civilian and combatant, bred a deep and corrosive suspicion. Trust, the essential glue of any community, simply dissolved. Every stranger was a potential threat, and every familiar face could be concealing a deadly secret. This constant uncertainty created a state of hypervigilance that was mentally and physically draining. People were always on guard. You learned to scan crowds, to check under your car for devices, to vary your daily routes. Your senses were perpetually heightened, attuned to any sign of danger. The simple act of living required an enormous amount of mental energy. This was not a temporary state of alert. For many, it was a permanent condition that lasted for years, even decades. This prolonged exposure to high levels of the stress hormone cortisol has profound effects on the brain and body, rewiring neural pathways and leaving individuals in a constant state of fight or flight. The nature of the violence was also deeply unpredictable. It could erupt anywhere, at any time. A quiet residential street could become a scene of carnage in an instant. This randomness was a key component of the terror. It meant that nowhere felt truly safe. Not your home. Not your workplace, not the local pub. The very concept of a sanctuary, a place where you could let your guard down, was eroded. People lived with a persistent low-level dread, an awareness that their world could be turned upside down without warning. This feeling of powerlessness, of being unable to protect yourself or your loved ones, is a powerful driver of psychological trauma. This environment of fear and suspicion had a profound impact on social interaction. People retreated into their own communities, their own tribes. The peace walls were as much psychological as they were physical. Crossing into a neighborhood controlled by the other side was a journey fraught with peril. Even within one's own community, paranoia could fester. Informers known as touts were a constant threat. Betrayal was a real and present danger, turning communities inward and making people suspicious even of their own friends and neighbors. This breakdown of social cohesion is one of the most insidious and lasting damages of such a conflict. You never slept properly, recalls Eileen, a former nurse who worked in Belfast's Royal Victoria Hospital during the height of the Troubles. Every time the phone rang in the middle of the night, your heart would leap into your throat. You were just waiting for the call to come in, for the next wave of casualties. We saw things a person should never have to see. Young lads torn to pieces. We'd patch them up as best we could, but the images, they stay with you. You'd go home, and you'd see their faces when you closed your eyes. There was no escape from it, not really. Eileen's account is a testament to the acute stress experienced by those on the front lines of care. For those involved more directly in the conflict, the stress was of a different order. A former loyalist paramilitary member, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the constant tension of life on the run. You were always looking over your shoulder. Every car that slowed down, every person who looked at you for a second too long. You couldn't trust anyone. We had our own code, our own rules. You couldn't show fear. Showing fear was weakness, and weakness could get you killed. So you buried it. You pushed it down deep with drink, with bravado, whatever it took. But it was always there, eating away at you from the inside. This pressure to conceal emotional turmoil was immense, particularly within the paramilitary organizations on both sides. Group loyalty demanded a facade of strength and unwavering commitment. Admitting to fear, anxiety, or doubt was seen as a betrayal of the cause and of your comrades. This created an environment where vulnerability was dangerous. Men and women who were, in many cases, barely out of their teens were expected to endure horrific violence and suppress any natural human reaction to it. This enforced denial of trauma did not make it go away. It simply forced it underground, where it would fester and mutate into more complex psychological problems later on. Coping mechanisms were often destructive. Alcohol abuse was rampant, a way to numb the nerves and quiet the memories. Some threw themselves deeper into the conflict, finding a strange sense of purpose and belonging in the chaos. For many ordinary civilians, the strategy was to make their world as small as possible. They stuck to familiar streets, avoided the city center, and tried to create a bubble of normalcy for their children amidst the madness. It was a collective exercise in denial, a necessary survival strategy. People tried to carry on, to go to work, to raise their families, all while pretending the war that was raging around them wasn't touching them, but it was touching everyone. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, it marked the official end of the Troubles. The guns fell silent, and a fragile peace descended. But for thousands of people, the war was far from over. It continued to rage within their own minds. The long-term, psychological consequences of 3 decades of violence began to emerge from the shadows. Experts soon identified widespread cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, a condition that, up until then, had mostly been associated with soldiers returning from conventional wars. In Belfast, though, the soldiers were civilians, and the battlefield had been their home. The symptoms of PTSD were textbook, yet their context was unique. Sufferers experienced intrusive flashbacks, reliving traumatic events as if they were happening all over again. Something as simple as a car backfiring could trigger a full-blown panic attack. Nightmares were common, dragging people back to the worst moments of their lives. Many developed a powerful avoidance response, refusing to go to certain places or see certain people that reminded them of their trauma. This led to social isolation and a shrinking of their world. A constant state of hyperarousal left them irritable, jumpy, and unable to relax, sleep, or concentrate, making normal life an immense struggle. Beyond PTSD, a whole host of other mental health issues became apparent. Rates of anxiety and depression soared in post-conflict Northern Ireland. Years of living with fear and uncertainty had taken their toll, leaving a deep sense of hopelessness and despair. For many, the end of the conflict did not bring relief, but a void. The structures and identities, however violent, that had defined their lives were gone, leaving them adrift. This was particularly true for ex-combatants. To cope with this enduring pain, many turned to substance abuse. Alcohol and drug addiction became serious problems, a form of self-medication for wounds that just refused to heal, and these conditions were not confined to those who had been directly involved in violence. The trauma was widespread. It affected the emergency service workers who had to deal with the horrific aftermath of attacks. It affected the bus drivers who had to navigate through riots. It affected the children who grew up seeing soldiers on their streets and hearing bombs in the distance. The entire society was, in a sense, traumatized. The long shadow of the conflict stretched over everyone, creating a population with a heavy burden of unresolved grief and psychological pain, a legacy that would complicate the path to a lasting and meaningful peace. Despite the clear and pressing need for mental health support, seeking help was, and often still is, incredibly difficult in Northern Ireland. One of the biggest barriers was stigma. In a culture that valued stoicism and resilience, admitting to a psychological struggle was often perceived as a sign of weakness. This was especially true for men and for those who had been involved in paramilitary groups. The very idea of talking about one's feelings was alien and uncomfortable. There was a pervasive belief that you should just get on with it, to keep a stiff upper lip and carry your burdens in silence. This cultural pressure created a powerful wall of silence around mental health. Mistrust of authority was another significant hurdle. For decades, institutions like the government, the police, and even the healthcare system were seen by many, particularly in nationalist communities, as instruments of the state. This deep-seated suspicion did not disappear overnight with the signing of a peace accord. People were reluctant to share their deepest traumas with official bodies they did not trust. There was a fear that what they said could be used against them, or that they would be judged or misunderstood. This lack of trust made it very difficult for state-led mental health services to reach the communities that needed them most. Within paramilitary circles, both loyalist and Republican, there was an added layer of fear. Ex-combatants worried that speaking to a therapist might involve confessing to illegal activities. The code of silence, or omerta, that governed these groups during the conflict remained powerful, even in peacetime. Breaking that silence could be seen as a betrayal, leading to ostracism from their community, or, in some cases, a genuine fear of retribution. This left many former fighters trapped with their trauma, unable to seek professional help for fear of the social or legal consequences. They were isolated by the very codes of loyalty that had once sustained them. Furthermore, there was a simple lack of adequate resources and expertise in the immediate post-conflict years. The healthcare system was geared towards dealing with physical injuries, not the complex, long-term psychological fallout of a civil conflict. There was a shortage of therapists trained in treating complex trauma like PTSD. This meant that even for those who did manage to overcome the stigma and mistrust, getting timely and effective help was a challenge. The system was simply not prepared for the scale of the mental health crisis that the Troubles had left in its wake, forcing many to rely on grassroots, community-led initiatives that were often underfunded and overstretched. The trauma of the Troubles did not stop with the generation that lived through it. Like a persistent aftershock, its effects have rippled down through families, creating what experts call intergenerational trauma. This is the process by which the traumatic experience of one generation are passed on to the next. It is not passed on through genes but through behaviors, family dynamics, and the environment in which children are raised. Parents who are suffering from untreated PTSD, anxiety, or depression struggle to provide the stable, nurturing environment that children need to thrive. Their own pain inadvertently shapes the emotional world of their children. Children of traumatized parents can absorb their parents' anxiety and fear. They grow up in households where the emotional climate is unpredictable, where a parent might be withdrawn and depressed one moment, and irritable or angry the next. They learn that the world is an unsafe place. They may develop a sense of hypervigilance themselves, always on the lookout for danger, just as their parents were. These children can inherit coping mechanisms, both good and bad. They might learn to suppress their own emotions, just as their parents did, believing that it is not safe or acceptable to show vulnerability. In communities deeply affected by the conflict, this trauma becomes a collective inheritance. The stories, the grievances, and the fears of the past are passed down, not just within families, but throughout the community. Young people who have no direct memory of the violence can still inherit the sectarian attitudes, the mistrust of the other side, and the sense of victimhood that defined their parents' generation. The murals on the walls, the annual parades, and the segregated schooling all serve to keep the divisions of the past alive, embedding them in the consciousness of the young. This makes it incredibly difficult to break the cycle of conflict. This transmission of trauma has profound implications for the peace process. A generation that has inherited the anxieties and animosities of the past may be less willing to engage in reconciliation and compromise. The us and them mentality becomes deeply ingrained, making it harder to build a shared future. Healing a society, therefore, is not just about helping the individuals who directly experience the trauma. It is also about finding ways to interrupt this cycle of transmission. It requires creating opportunities for young people to connect across community divides and to build a new identity for Northern Ireland, one that is not defined solely by the shadows of its violent past. For the thousands of men and women who were active as combatants in paramilitary groups, the transition to peace presented a unique and profound set of challenges. During the conflict, their lives had a clear, if violent, sense of purpose and identity. They were soldiers in a cause they believed in. They had a role, a status within their community, and a strong sense of camaraderie with their fellow fighters. The end of the conflict stripped all of that away. Suddenly, they were no longer soldiers but unemployed men and women in a society that was trying to move on. They were left with their memories, their trauma, and a profound sense of dislocation. Reintegration into normal life was fraught with difficulty. Many ex-combatants struggled to find work. They often had criminal records, a lack of formal qualifications, and skills that were not transferable to the civilian workplace. The very identity that had given them status in their community now made them unemployable in the wider world. This led to a loss of self-esteem and a feeling of being left behind by the peace process. The adrenaline and purpose of the conflict were replaced by the monotony and frustration of unemployment and marginalization. This void was often filled with depression, anxiety, and a turn towards alcohol or drugs. The psychological burden they carried was immense. Many were haunted by what they had seen and done. Guilt, shame, and remorse were common, but often impossible to express. The same code of silence that prevented them from showing fear during the conflict now prevented them from processing their actions in its aftermath. They were trapped in a lonely struggle with their past. At the same time, they had to contend with the trauma of their own losses. Friends killed, years lost to prison, and the psychological wounds from living a life of violence. This complex mix of being both a perpetrator and a victim of trauma is incredibly difficult to resolve without professional help. In response to this crisis, a number of remarkable grassroots initiatives have emerged, often led by ex-combatants themselves. These community-based projects provide a vital lifeline for those struggling to adapt to peace. They offer counseling, support groups, and opportunities for retraining and employment. They create safe spaces where former fighters can talk openly with their peers, people who understand their experiences without judgment. These organizations play a crucial role in healing, helping individuals to rebuild their lives, find a new sense of purpose, and begin the long, difficult journey of walking away from war and finding their place in a new, peaceful society. The story of Belfast's hidden trauma is not just a piece of Irish history, it is a powerful and universal lesson about the true cost of conflict. The deep psychological wounds left by the Troubles demonstrate that the end of fighting is not the same as the beginning of peace. A peace agreement can silence the guns, but it cannot instantly heal the minds and hearts of those who have lived through war. The bitterness, fear, and mistrust sown by violence can linger for generations, acting as a powerful obstacle to true and lasting reconciliation. The shadow of the past can prevent a society from moving forward into a shared future. Making peace is not just a political process, it is a deeply psychological one. It requires more than just treaties and handshakes. It requires acknowledging the pain of the past and providing real, accessible support for those who are suffering. It means tackling the stigma around mental health and building systems of care that are trusted by all communities. It means investing in the long, slow work of healing individuals, families, and the collective social fabric. Without this commitment to psychological healing, any peace will remain fragile, vulnerable to being fractured by the unresolved traumas simmering just beneath the surface. Ultimately, Belfast's journey is a powerful plea for empathy and a call to action. It reminds us that the human consequences of war are devastating and far-reaching. It urges us to look beyond the headlines and to see the hidden suffering that conflict leaves in its wake. And it challenges us all to prioritize peace, to invest in peaceful solutions to disputes, and to support the mental and emotional well-being of all those affected by violence. For in the quiet resilience of a Belfast community garden, in the difficult conversations of a support group, we see the enduring human desire to heal, to connect, and to build a future free from the shadows of the past.